Chapter 1. The Ordinary Life of David Mercer. The alarm clock on David Mercer's nightstand read 5:47 a.m. when his eyes opened, 13 minutes before it was set to ring. He had always been that way, waking just before the alarm as if his body refused to be startled into consciousness. It was a small thing, this habit, but it represented something larger about who David was. A man who liked to be prepared, who valued order, who believed that if you followed the rules and did things right, life would treat you fairly in return. He lay there for a moment in the pre-dawn darkness of his bedroom in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, listening to the steady breathing of his wife Sarah beside him. 22 years of marriage, and he still found comfort in that sound. Through the half-open window, he could hear the first birds beginning their morning chorus, could smell the faint scent of honeysuckle from Sarah's garden below. It was late May, that perfect time of year when spring was giving way to summer, when everything felt possible and new. David eased himself out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake Sarah. She had been up late the night before, grading papers. She taught 5th grade at Millbrook Elementary, and he knew she needed the sleep. He moved through their morning routine with practiced efficiency. Shower, shave, the same white dress shirt and navy tie he wore most days. At 53, David had settled into a comfortable rhythm, and he saw no reason to disturb it. Downstairs, he started the coffee maker, the familiar gurgle and hiss filling the quiet kitchen. While it brewed, he stood at the window looking out at their backyard. The grass needed mowing. He'd do that Saturday, same as always. The swing set he'd built for their daughter Emma 15 years ago still stood in the corner, though Emma was now a sophomore at Penn State studying biology. The sight of it made him smile, made him think of all those summer evenings pushing her higher and higher while she shrieked with delighted terror. "You're going to push me to the moon, Daddy?" "Not quite that high, sweetheart. Maybe just to the treetops." Those days felt both impossibly distant and achingly close. Time did that, he'd learned. It moved in strange ways, speeding up and slowing down without warning. David worked as a quality control supervisor at Brandt Manufacturing, a mid-sized company that produced component parts for agricultural machinery. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work, and he was good at it. He'd been there for 26 years, starting fresh out of college on the factory floor and working his way up. The people there weren't just colleagues. They were friends, people he'd watched get married, have kids, go through divorces, celebrate promotions, survive layoffs. Tom Brennan, who worked in accounting, had been his best friend since their daughters were in the same kindergarten class. Rita Alvarez in shipping had taught him basic Spanish during lunch breaks. Marcus Webb, one of the line supervisors, always saved him a seat at the annual company picnic. He believed in the company, believed in the work they did. More than that, he believed in doing things the right way. When he found defects in parts, he reported them, every time, no matter how small. When safety protocols needed updating, he pushed for the changes. When new employees needed training, he volunteered his time. This was what you did. You showed up, you did your job well, you looked out for the people around you. The coffee finished brewing, and David poured himself a cup, black, no sugar. He'd quit sugar 10 years ago when his doctor had warned him about his cholesterol. Another rule followed, another box checked. Sarah told him sometimes that he was too rigid, too bound by routine, but she said it with affection. She understood that this was how he made sense of the world. He settled at the kitchen table with his coffee and the morning paper. The Millbrook Gazette was a thin publication, mostly local news, high school sports scores, announcements of town council meetings and church bake sales. But David read it faithfully every morning, cover to cover. This was his community, these were his neighbors, and he believed in staying informed. This morning's front page featured a story about the upcoming Memorial Day parade, speculation about whether the Henderson farm would be sold to developers, and a piece about budget concerns at the school district. Normal things. Good things. The kind of news that confirmed his belief that Millbrook was exactly what it seemed to be, a decent, honest place where people cared about each other. At 6:45, Sarah came down in her bathrobe, her graying hair still tousled from sleep. "You're up early," David said, looking up from the paper. "Couldn't sleep," she said, moving to pour herself coffee. "Keep thinking about the Jameson boy." David knew who she meant. Tyler Jameson, one of her students whose father had lost his job at the mill 6 months ago. Sarah had been quietly paying for the boys' lunches, something she thought David didn't know about, though of course he did. He'd seen the receipts. "He doing okay?" David asked. "He's struggling. Not just with the work, he's bright enough. But he comes to school hungry, David. In America. In 2024. A 10-year-old boy coming to school hungry." There was pain in her voice, the kind that came from caring too much, from seeing unfairness and being unable to fully correct it. David stood and wrapped his arms around her. "You're doing what you can," he said softly. "That matters." "Does it? Sometimes I wonder if any of it matters. If we're just putting band-aids on problems that need surgery." "It matters," David insisted because he needed to believe it was true. "Every kindness matters. Every time we show up and try to do right by people, it matters." Sarah leaned into him, and they stood that way for a long moment, two people who had built a life together on the foundation of trying to be good, trying to make things better where they could. By 7:15, David was in his silver Honda Accord, backing out of the driveway. He waved to Mrs. Patterson next door, who was retrieving her newspaper in her pink bathrobe, same as every morning. Drove down Maple Street, past the park where he'd coached Emma's softball team, past the Presbyterian church where he and Sarah had been married, past Henderson's Hardware where he'd bought the lumber for the swing set. The drive to Brandt Manufacturing took exactly 18 minutes. David knew because he'd made this drive 5 days a week for 26 years, and it was always 18 minutes, give or take a minute for traffic. The familiarity of it was comforting, the way the route was etched into his muscle memory so deeply that he barely had to think about the turns. The factory was a sprawling complex of gray buildings on the eastern edge of town, surrounded by chain-link fencing and employee parking lots. David pulled into his usual spot, third row, fourth space from the left, and gathered his lunch bag from the passenger seat. Sarah had packed it the night before: turkey sandwich, apple, granola bar, same as always. He appreciated her consistency, the way they moved through life in parallel routines that supported each other. Inside, the factory floor was already humming with activity. The first shift had started at 7, and the familiar sounds of machinery, of hydraulic presses and conveyor belts, and the rhythmic clang of metal on metal, created a kind of industrial symphony that David had long ago learned to find almost musical. This was productive work, things being made, components that would become parts of combines and tractors that would harvest food that would feed families. There was dignity in that, he believed. Honest purpose. "Morning, David." Marcus Webb called out from near the Line 3 inspection station. Marcus was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, always grinning, always ready with a joke or a word of encouragement. "You catch the game last night?" "Fell asleep in the 6th inning," David admitted. "Sarah says I'm getting old." "Sarah's a wise woman," Marcus laughed. "We rallied in the 8th though. You missed a hell of a finish." David made his way to his office, a small glass-walled room that overlooked the main production floor. From here he could monitor operations, review quality control reports, coordinate with the various shift supervisors. It wasn't a corner office with a view, but it was his domain and he took pride in it. On his desk was a stack of inspection reports from the previous day's second shift. David settled into his chair and began reviewing them methodically, checking measurements against specifications, looking for patterns that might indicate equipment calibration issues or material inconsistencies. This was detailed work, requiring concentration and precision, and David was good at it. Very good. He'd been at it for maybe 30 minutes when his phone rang. The internal line. "David Mercer," he answered. "David, it's Phil. Can you come up to my office?" Phil Hendricks, the plant manager. David had known Phil for 15 years, had watched him work his way up from production scheduler to his current position. They'd had beers together after work, had been to each other's houses for barbecues. Phil's voice sounded strange though. Tight. Formal. "Sure thing," David said. "Be right there." He hung up and stood, smoothing his tie reflexively. Probably just wanted to discuss the quarterly quality metrics or next month's production schedule. Nothing to worry about. Still, something in Phil's tone had set off a small alarm bell in the back of David's mind. The walk to Phil's office took him through the administrative wing, past Rita's desk in shipping where she was on the phone in rapid Spanish, past the break room where someone had brought in donuts, past the HR department where Jennifer Morrison was typing at her computer. Normal Tuesday morning at Brandt Manufacturing. Phil's door was closed. David knocked. "Come in." David opened the door and immediately knew something was wrong. Phil sat behind his desk, his face drawn and uncomfortable. And in the chairs facing the desk sat two people David didn't recognize: a woman in a dark pantsuit with sharp features and calculating eyes, and a man in his 30s with a buzz cut and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "David, have a seat," Phil said, not meeting his eyes. "This is Special Agent Catherine Reynolds from the FBI, and this is Detective Mark Corbin from the Pennsylvania State Police." The words seemed to hang in the air, impossible and surreal. FBI. State Police. David felt his pulse quicken as he lowered himself into the empty chair, his mind racing through possibilities, trying to understand what was happening. "Mr. Mercer," Agent Reynolds said, her voice crisp and professional, We need to ask you some questions about your role here at Brandt Manufacturing, specifically regarding quality control procedures and product certifications. David's mouth had gone dry. Of course, he managed. Happy to help however I can. I'm sure you are, Reynolds said, and something in her smile made David's stomach turn to ice. Let's start with what you know about fraudulent safety certifications on parts shipped to Morrison agricultural equipment over the past 18 months. The words crashed over David like a wave. Fraudulent safety certifications. He shook his head, confusion and the first stirrings of panic rising in his chest. I don't know anything about that, he said. All our certifications are legitimate. I personally oversee. You personally oversee the quality control process, yes, Detective Corbin cut in. Which is why we're here talking to you. David looked at Phil, seeking some kind of anchor, some explanation, but Phil was staring at his desk, his jaw tight. There must be some mistake, David said, hearing the shake in his own voice and hating it. We would never certify parts that didn't meet specifications. That's not just against regulations, it's dangerous. People could be hurt. People were hurt, Mr. Mercer, Agent Reynolds said quietly. She opened a folder and slid a photograph across the desk. It showed a piece of agricultural machinery, twisted and burned, surrounded by emergency vehicles. Carl Patterson, 46 years old, father of 3. Killed when a combine's braking system failed during harvest season last October. The failed component was manufactured here. The safety certification was signed by you. David stared at the photograph, his vision swimming. The name Patterson echoed in his head. Mrs. Patterson next door. Pink bathrobe. Morning newspaper. Could it be? I need to see the documentation, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to see what you're talking about because I'm telling you, I never certified anything that didn't meet spec. Never. Not once. Agent Reynolds pulled out another document, placed it in front of him. It was a certification form, dated 8 months prior. And there, at the bottom, was a signature that looked exactly like his own. David Mercer stared at his signature beneath words certifying parts he had never inspected, approving standards he had never verified, vouching for safety he had never confirmed. And in that moment, in Phil Hendrick's office on an ordinary Tuesday morning in May, the foundation of David Mercer's entire world began to crack. Chapter 2, The Unraveling. The interrogation room at the Pennsylvania State Police Barracks in Harrisburg was nothing like the ones David had seen on television. There was no two-way mirror, no dramatic lighting, no good cop offering coffee while the bad cop loomed threateningly. Instead, it was just a small, beige room with fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly, a plain table for chairs, and a camera mounted in the corner with a red light that never blinked off. David had been sitting there for 6 hours. They had driven him from the plant in an unmarked car, Agent Reynolds in the front passenger seat, Detective Corbin driving, David in the back like a criminal. Like someone who had done something wrong. The whole drive, he tried to explain, tried to make them understand that there had been a mistake, that he would never falsify certifications, that his entire career had been built on doing things the right way. You'll have plenty of time to tell your story, Reynolds had said without turning around. I'd recommend you wait until you have a lawyer present. A lawyer. The word had sent another spike of fear through David's chest. He didn't need a lawyer. Lawyers were for guilty people, for people who had actually done something wrong. He just needed to clear this up, to show them the records, to prove that whatever had happened, it wasn't him. Except he couldn't prove anything because they had his signature. Multiple times. On certifications for parts he didn't remember inspecting, shipments he didn't recall approving, safety standards he never would have vouched for without verification. The door opened and Agent Reynolds entered carrying a thick file folder and a bottle of water. She set the water in front of David without a word and sat down across from him. Have you thought about what we discussed? She asked. David reached for the water with shaking hands. His mouth felt like sandpaper. I've thought about nothing else, he said. And I keep coming back to the same thing, I didn't do this. I don't know how my signature got on those forms, but it wasn't me. Reynolds opened the folder and began laying out documents, one after another, creating a mosaic of damning evidence across the table. Certifications, shipping manifests, internal memos, email printouts. David's name was everywhere. His signature. His employee ID number. His email address. Let's walk through this systematically, Reynolds said. March 15th of last year. Do you remember inspecting lot number A7734 brake assembly components for Morrison Agricultural? David stared at the date, trying to pull up the memory. March of last year. Spring. Emma had come home for spring break. Sarah's mother had been in the hospital with pneumonia. He'd been worried, distracted. But work, he always kept work separate. He was always careful. I don't specifically remember that lot, he admitted. We process dozens of lots every week. But if my signature is on the certification, then I must have inspected it. Must have. Reynolds leaned forward. Or did. I would have. That's my job. I don't sign off on anything without personally verifying the specs. Reynolds pulled out another document. This is an email from you to Phil Hendricks, dated March 18th. 3 days after that certification. You wrote, and I quote, Lot A, 7734 cleared and shipped per your instructions. Documentation complete. Do you remember sending that? David read the email. The words were there in black and white, sent from his work email address. But he had no memory of writing them. I must have sent it, he said weakly. But Phil never gave me special instructions about any lots. We have standard procedures. I follow them. So either you're lying now or you were lying then, Reynolds said flatly. Which is it, Mr. Mercer? Neither. I'm telling you. Let's talk about your financial situation, Reynolds interrupted, pulling out a new set of documents. You refinanced your house 2 years ago. Took out a home equity line of credit for $60,000. What was that for? The shift in topic disoriented David. My daughter's college tuition. Room and board. Penn State isn't cheap and she didn't qualify for much financial aid because Sarah and I make too much, but not enough to. He stopped, realizing he was rambling. What does this have to do with anything? You're carrying significant debt. Credit cards, the mortgage, car payments. According to your bank records, you've been living pretty close to the edge financially. Like half of America, David said, frustration creeping into his voice. That doesn't make me a criminal. No, Reynolds agreed. But it does give you motive. Someone was paying for those fraudulent certifications, Mr. Mercer. Someone was making money by cutting corners, by shipping substandard parts with fake safety approvals. We're going to find out who. And we're going to find out where that money went. It didn't come to me. David's voice rose and he forced himself to take a breath to calm down. Getting angry wouldn't help. He needed to think clearly. Look at my bank accounts. Look at everything. You won't find any unusual deposits, any unexplained income. Because I didn't take any money. I didn't falsify anything. Reynolds studied him for a long moment. Then explain the signatures, Mr. Mercer. Explain the emails. Explain why your name is attached to every single fraudulent certification we've uncovered over the past 18 months. I can't, David whispered. The words felt like admitting defeat, but they were true. He couldn't explain it. I don't know how this happened. But I swear to you, I didn't do it. The agent sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable. Here's what I think happened, she said. I think you're a decent guy who got in over his head. Maybe someone approached you, offered you money to look the other way on a few shipments. Maybe you thought it was harmless at first, just small stuff, nothing that would really hurt anyone. But then it escalated. And then Carl Patterson died, and suddenly you realized this wasn't a game anymore. No, David said firmly. That's not what happened because nothing happened. I never looked the other way. I never took money. I never... Then who did? Reynolds' voice sharpened. Because someone at Brandt Manufacturing was running this scheme. Someone with access to the quality control systems, someone who could authorize shipments, someone whose signature meant something. That's you, Mr. Mercer. All roads lead back to you. David felt tears burning behind his eyes and blinked them back furiously. He would not cry. Not here. Not now. I want to call my wife, he said. And I want a lawyer. Reynolds smiled thinly. Finally. Good decision. She stood and gathered her documents. For what it's worth, Mr. Mercer, I almost believe you. You seem genuinely confused. But confusion doesn't change the evidence. And the evidence says you're guilty. She left, and David was alone again with the buzzing lights and the unblinking red camera eye. Sarah arrived 3 hours later with a lawyer named Robert Chin, a criminal defense attorney from Harrisburg that her brother had recommended. Chin was in his early 40s, compact and intense, with wire-rimmed glasses and a leather briefcase that looked expensive. Don't say anything else without me present, were the first words out of Chen's mouth. Not one word. Do you understand? David nodded mutely. Seeing Sarah's face, pale, frightened, disbelieving, had broken something in him. She'd been crying. He could see the redness around her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she reached across the table to grip his. David, what's happening? Her voice was small, lost. They came to the house. They had a search warrant. They went through everything, your office, our bedroom, Emma's old room. They took your computer, your files, boxes of papers. The neighbors were watching. Mrs. Patterson, her voice broke. Mrs. Patterson asked me if it was true. If you were responsible for her husband's death. The words hit David like physical blows. Mrs. Patterson. Pink bathrobe. Morning newspaper. Her husband, Carl, killed in a combined accident. The photograph Agent Reynolds had shown him. It's not true, David said, his voice hoarse. Sarah, you have to believe me. I didn't do any of this. I don't know how. Mr. Mercer. Chen's voice was sharp. Not another word. I need to speak with the investigators and review the evidence before you make any statements. He turned to Sarah. Mrs. Mercer, I'm going to need you to step outside for a moment while I consult with my client. Sarah squeezed David's hand one more time, her eyes searching his face. Looking for what? Reassurance? Truth? Some sign that the man she'd spent 22 years with wasn't a stranger? I love you, David said desperately. Sarah, I love you. I didn't do this. She nodded, but he could see the doubt flickering behind her eyes. The small crack of uncertainty. And why shouldn't she doubt? Everyone else did. The evidence was there, undeniable, his signature on documents that had led to a man's death. When Sarah left, Chin sat down and opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency. All right, he said. I need you to tell me everything from the beginning. And I mean everything, Mr. Mercer. The smallest detail could be important. So David told him. About the morning, the call from Phil, the interrogation, the documents with his signature that he didn't remember signing. About his career, his reputation, his belief in doing things right. About the financial records they'd mentioned, the debt that was normal, manageable, not desperate. Chin took notes on a yellow legal pad, his pen scratching steadily. When David finished, the lawyer sat back and removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. This is bad, he said bluntly. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The documentary evidence is damning. Your signature, your email, your employee credentials, it all points directly at you. The prosecution is going to argue that you were the one who certified these fraudulent parts, either for financial gain or because you were pressured by someone higher up in the company. But I didn't. I believe you, Chin interrupted. Or at least, I'm willing to proceed on the assumption that you're telling the truth. But belief isn't enough. We need to prove it. We need to show reasonable doubt at minimum, preferably an alternative explanation for how this happened. How do we do that? Chin put his glasses back on. We start by investigating Brandt Manufacturing top to bottom. Who else had access to the quality control systems? Who could have forged your signature or used your credentials? Were there any unusual patterns in the way these fraudulent certifications were processed? Any witnesses who can testify to your normal procedures and practices? Tom Brennan, David said suddenly. My friend in accounting. He processes all the shipping invoices. He might have noticed something unusual. Good. Anyone else? Rita Alvarez in shipping, Marcus Webb from the line supervisors, Jennifer Morrison in HR. These are people who've known me for years. They know I would never. Character witnesses are helpful, Chin said, but they won't overcome hard evidence. We need more than people saying you're a good guy. We need to prove someone else did this. David felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. His whole life, he'd believed that truth mattered, that if you were innocent, the system would protect you. That justice actually meant something. But sitting in this beige room with its buzzing lights and watchful camera, that belief felt naive, childish. What happens now? He asked quietly. They're going to charge you, Chin said. Probably multiple counts, fraud, falsifying federal documents, criminal negligence at minimum. Depending on how aggressive the prosecutor wants to be, possibly manslaughter in connection with Carl Patterson's death. Manslaughter. The word settled over David like a suffocating blanket. You'll be arraigned probably tomorrow. I'll argue for bail, and given your clean record and ties to the community, I think we have a good chance. But you need to prepare yourself, Mr. Mercer. This is going to get worse before it gets better. The media will cover it. Your name will be in the papers. People are going to assume you're guilty. I trusted the system, David said, almost to himself. I believed that if you did the right thing, told the truth, followed the rules. Chen's expression softened slightly. The system isn't perfect, he said. Sometimes it fails people. Sometimes innocent people get caught up in it. My job is to make sure that doesn't happen to you. But I need you to understand the reality we're facing. The odds are not in our favor right now. Through the small window in the door, David could see Sarah in the hallway, sitting in a plastic chair with her head in her hands. 22 years of marriage. A daughter in college. A house with a mortgage and a garden full of honeysuckle. A life built on the foundation of trust and routine and the belief that goodness mattered. All of it crumbling, and he couldn't stop it. Couldn't explain it. Couldn't make anyone believe that he was telling the truth. Agent Reynolds appeared in the hallway, spoke briefly to Sarah. Even from here, David could see his wife flinch, could see her shoulders curve inward as if protecting herself from a blow. The door opened and Reynolds entered with Detective Corbin. "David Mercer," she said formally, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "You are under arrest for fraud, falsification of federal safety documents, and criminal negligence resulting in death. You have the right to remain silent." The words continued, but David barely heard them over the roaring in his ears. The handcuffs were cold against his wrists. Through the open door, he could see Sarah standing now, tears streaming down her face, Chen's hand on her shoulder trying to offer comfort that couldn't touch the magnitude of what was happening. "I didn't do this," David said one more time to no one and everyone. "I didn't do this." But his voice was lost in the machinery of the system he had trusted. The system that was now grinding him down with the cold efficiency of the factory floor where he'd spent 26 years believing in honest work and fair treatment. They led him away, and the last thing he saw before the door closed was Sarah's face, twisted with anguish and the terrible uncertainty of not knowing whether the man she loved was the man she thought she knew. The crack in his world had become a chasm, and David Mercer was falling. Chapter 3: The Truth in the Shadows. The Millbrook County Jail was a squat, brick building that David had driven past 1,000 times without truly seeing it. Now, from the inside he saw every detail with painful clarity. The scuffed linoleum floors, the fluorescent lights that never fully dimmed, the smell of industrial cleaner failing to mask something more human and desperate underneath, the constant noise, metal doors clanging, voices echoing, footsteps reverberating through concrete corridors. They had set his bail at $250,000. Robert Chin had argued that David was a pillar of the community, no flight risk, no criminal history, a man who had never even received a speeding ticket. The prosecutor had countered with the severity of the charges, the death of Carl Patterson, the ongoing federal investigation into what they were now calling a conspiracy that had put hundreds of lives at risk. The judge had split the difference, and David's bail was set at $250,000. Sarah had to put up their house as collateral. Their home. The place where they'd raised Emma, where they'd built their life together. One more thing that could be taken away, one more piece of their foundation that was now at risk. David had been in jail for 4 days before the bail was processed. 4 days that felt like 4 years. He'd been given an orange jumpsuit and assigned to a cell with a man named Jerome who was awaiting trial on drug charges and spent most of his time staring at the wall with empty eyes. At night, David lay on the thin mattress listening to the sounds of the jail, someone crying in a distant cell, guards making their rounds, the occasional shout or argument, and tried to understand how his life had arrived at this moment. When Sarah finally picked him up, they barely spoke during the drive home. What was there to say? The words felt inadequate, too small to contain the enormity of what was happening. She kept her eyes on the road, her hands gripped tight on the steering wheel, and David watched the familiar streets of Millbrook roll past the window, everything looking the same but feeling irrevocably different. Mrs. Patterson's house had a for sale sign in the front yard now. Their own house felt like foreign territory when they walked inside. The police search had left everything slightly disheveled, books out of order on shelves, drawers not quite closed all the way, subtle evidence that strangers had been through their private spaces. David stood in the living room, feeling like an intruder in his own home. "Emma called," Sarah said quietly, setting her purse on the kitchen counter. She saw the news online. Someone sent her a link to an article. David closed his eyes. His daughter. His brilliant, sensitive daughter who was supposed to be worrying about exams and boys and what to do with her summer, not whether her father was a criminal. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were innocent. That there had been a terrible mistake." Sarah's voice cracked. She wanted to come home. "I told her to stay at school to focus on her finals. That we would handle this. Do you believe it?" The question came out before David could stop it. "That I'm innocent?" Sarah turned to face him, and the pain in her eyes was almost more than he could bear. "I want to," she said. "David, I want to believe you more than anything. But they have your signature. Your emails. They searched this house and took boxes of evidence. Everyone is saying." "I don't care what everyone is saying," David interrupted, moving toward her. "I care what you think, what you believe. Sarah, you've known me for 25 years. Have I ever lied to you? Have I ever cut corners or done anything dishonest?" "No," she whispered. "Never. But people are saying you were under financial pressure, that you were desperate. We're not desperate. We're doing fine. The debt is manageable. We've never missed a payment on anything. This idea that I would risk everything would risk people's lives for money, it's insane. Sarah sank into a chair at the kitchen table, and David saw how exhausted she looked, how the last week had aged her. Then explain it to me, she said. Make me understand how your signature ended up on those documents if you didn't put it there. I can't explain it yet, David admitted. But Robert Chin is investigating. He has people looking into the quality control systems at Brandt, checking for security breaches, trying to figure out who else could have accessed my credentials. And what if he doesn't find anything? What if there's no other explanation? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. David sat down across from her, reaching for her hands. She let him take them, but her fingers were limp, unresponsive. Then I'll go to prison for something I didn't do, he said quietly. But Sarah, I need you to know the truth even if no one else believes it. I didn't falsify those certifications. I didn't take money. I didn't cause Carl Patterson's death. I swear to you on everything we've built together, on Emma's life, on my own soul, I didn't do this. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I'm so scared, she whispered. I'm terrified of losing you, of losing everything, of finding out that I don't know you as well as I thought I did. Before David could respond, his phone rang. He'd gotten it back when he was released, along with his wallet and keys. The screen showed Robert Chen's number. I need to take this, David said, standing. He answered as he walked into the living room. Robert. David, we need to meet. Tomorrow morning, my office. I found something. David's heart lurched. What? What did you find? Not over the phone. But David, Chin paused. This goes deeper than we thought. Much deeper. Bring Sarah if you want, but come prepared for bad news. Worse than being charged with manslaughter? Different kind of bad, Chin said. Just be there at 9. And David? Be careful. Watch who you talk to. Trust no one from Brandt Manufacturing until we sort this out. The line went dead. David stood holding the phone, Chen's words echoing in his mind. Trust no one from Brandt Manufacturing. But those were his friends. His colleagues. People he'd worked alongside for decades. Tom Brennan, Rita Alvarez, Marcus Webb. These were people who knew him, who could vouch for his character. Weren't they? A new thought crept into David's mind, cold and unwelcome. If someone had forged his signature, if someone had used his credentials to falsify documents, it had to be someone inside the company. Someone with access to the systems. Someone who knew his routines well enough to forge his handwriting convincingly. Someone who knew him. Someone he trusted. That night, David couldn't sleep. He lay in bed next to Sarah, listening to her breathing, trying to remember every detail of the past 18 months. The lots that had been certified fraudulently, had he been on vacation for any of them? Had he been sick? Had there been days when someone else might have handled his responsibilities? He kept coming back to March of last year. Spring break. Sarah's mother in the hospital. He'd taken 3 days off work to be with Sarah, to help with her mother's care. 3 days when someone else would have been handling quality control. But who? And why frame him? The questions circled in his mind like vultures, offering no answers, only more doubt and fear. At 3 a.m., David gave up on sleep and went downstairs to his home office. The police had taken his work computer, but his personal laptop was still there. He opened it and began searching for news coverage of Carl Patterson's death. The articles were brutal. Respected farmer, beloved father, active in his church and community. The combine accident had been catastrophic. The braking system had failed completely while he was working a slope, and the massive machine had rolled. Patterson had been crushed. He'd died at the scene, leaving behind a wife, 3 children, and a community in mourning. And now that community believed David Mercer had killed him through negligence and greed. David found a photo of the Patterson family at Carl's funeral. The widow, Linda, stood between 2 teenage sons and a daughter who couldn't have been more than 12. Their faces were masks of grief, and David felt physically ill looking at them. If he'd actually been responsible for this, he deserved everything that was happening to him. But he wasn't. He couldn't be. He would never have certified faulty parts. Never. So who had? David opened a new search window and typed in Brandt Manufacturing fraud. The results were extensive and recent. News articles about the federal investigation, speculation about how widespread the problem might be, interviews with industry experts discussing the implications for agricultural safety standards. And there, buried in a longer piece from a business journal, was a detail that made David's blood run cold. Sources familiar with the investigation suggest that the fraudulent certification scheme may have been operating for over 3 years, significantly longer than initially believed. If true, this would indicate a systematic pattern of corruption rather than isolated incidents. 3 years. David had been quality control supervisor for 7 years. If this had been going on for 3 years, there would be hundreds of certifications with his signature. Hundreds of opportunities for someone to have framed him. But it also meant that someone had been planning this for a long time. Building a case against him, piece by piece, signature by signature. This wasn't spontaneous or opportunistic. This was deliberate, calculated, patient. This was personal. David thought of everyone at Brandt who might have a grudge against him, anyone he'd crossed or disciplined or passed over for a promotion. The list was short. He'd always tried to be fair, to treat people with respect. He'd made enemies of no one, or so he'd thought. But someone had made an enemy of him. Someone had decided to destroy his life, and they'd been methodical about it. The sky outside his window was beginning to lighten when Sarah found him still at the computer, surrounded by printouts of articles and handwritten notes. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked from the doorway. "Couldn't," David said. "Sarah, this has been going on for years. Someone at Brandt has been systematically framing me, building a case that would eventually come to light and destroy everything I've built." Sarah came closer, looking at the notes spread across his desk. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would someone do that to you?" "I don't know," David admitted. "But I'm going to find out. Robert said he found something. Maybe he has answers." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I talked to Tom Brennan's wife yesterday. Susan called to say how sorry she was, how she couldn't believe this was happening." "That's good," David said, looking up at her. "Tom's been my friend for." She also said Tom had been telling people at the company that he always thought there was something off about you. That you were too rigid, too controlling about procedures. That maybe all that perfectionism was hiding something. The words hit David like a slap. Tom Brennan. His best friend. The man whose daughter had played with Emma, whose family had been to their house dozens of times. "That can't be right," David said weakly. "Tom wouldn't." "I'm just telling you what Susan said," Sarah replied. Maybe she misunderstood. Maybe Tom was just trying to make sense of it all. "But David, if Robert says to trust no one from Brandt, maybe you should listen." David stared at the notes on his desk, at the evidence of a conspiracy that had been built around him like a cage, and felt the last of his certainty crumble. He had trusted the system. He had trusted his colleagues. He had trusted that honesty and hard work mattered. But someone had used that trust against him, had weaponized his faith in the way things were supposed to work, and now he was trapped in a nightmare with no clear way out. "We should get ready," Sarah said quietly. "The appointment with Robert is in 5 hours." David nodded, but he didn't move. He sat there in his office, in the home that might be taken from him, looking at the face of Carl Patterson's widow and wondering if the truth, whatever it was, would even matter by the time anyone bothered to find it. Chapter 4, The Breaking Point. Robert Chen's office was in a converted Victorian house in downtown Harrisburg, the kind of place that tried to balance professional credibility with approachable warmth. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs, diplomas on the wall next to family photos. David barely registered any of it as he and Sarah were ushered into Chen's private office on the second floor. Chen was already seated behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. Next to him sat a woman David didn't recognize, mid-30s, auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a gray suit that seemed designed to convey both competence and a certain hardness. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, and when she looked at David, he felt like a specimen being examined under a microscope. "Mr. and Mrs. Mercer," Chen said, standing. "Thank you for coming. This is Diane Foster. She's a forensic accountant and digital security specialist I've brought onto your case." Foster extended her hand and David shook it mechanically. Her grip was firm, businesslike. Sarah remained standing slightly behind him, her arms wrapped around herself as if warding off a chill. "Please sit," Chen said, gesturing to the chairs across from his desk. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear, but it's important that you understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." David and Sarah sat. David's hands were trembling, so he clasped them together in his lap, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. Chin nodded to Foster, who opened a laptop and turned it so the screen was visible to David and Sarah. "I've spent the last 4 days analyzing Brandt Manufacturing's quality control systems, Mr. Mercer," she began without preamble. "Specifically, I've been looking at access logs, digital signatures, and the authentication protocols used for certification documents." "And?" David's voice came out as a croak. "And what I found is both good news and bad news," Foster said. "The good news is that I can prove, definitively, that many of the certifications bearing your signature were created when you were not logged into the system. Some were generated while you were on vacation. Others were created outside of normal business hours when security footage shows you had already left the building." Relief flooded through David so powerfully that he felt lightheaded. "That proves I didn't do it," he said, looking at Sarah, then back at Foster. "That proves someone else was using my credentials." "It proves someone else had access to your credentials," Foster corrected. "Which brings us to the bad news." Chin leaned forward, his expression grave. "David, whoever did this didn't just forge your signature on a few documents. They created a comprehensive digital trail that implicates you in a conspiracy that goes far beyond quality control fraud." Foster turned the laptop toward herself and began typing. "I found evidence of a series of encrypted communications originating from your work computer over the past 3 years. The encryption was sophisticated but not sophisticated enough. I was able to decrypt portions of the messages." She turned the laptop back around, and David found himself looking at what appeared to be email exchanges. His email address was at the top. The messages discussed payment schedules, shipment quotas, strategies for avoiding detection. They referenced offshore accounts, cryptocurrency transfers, coded language about packages, and deliveries that clearly meant something other than their literal interpretation. "I never wrote these," David said, his voice rising. "I've never seen these emails before in my life." "I believe you," Foster said, "because these emails were never actually sent through the normal email server. They were created as files, backdated, and planted in a hidden partition on your work computer. Whoever did this was building a false history of your involvement in the fraud scheme." Sarah's hand found David's and gripped it tightly. "But you can prove they're fake?" she asked. "You can show they were planted?" Foster's expression darkened. "I can show that they exist in a suspicious location and that the metadata has been manipulated. But proving definitively that David didn't write them? That's harder. A prosecutor could argue that David created the hidden partition himself to compartmentalize his illegal activities. That he manipulated the metadata to create plausible deniability. That's insane," David said. "I barely know how to use email beyond basic functions. I wouldn't know how to create hidden partitions or manipulate metadata or any of this. Which is why we're going to need expert testimony to explain the technical sophistication required to do what was done," Chin said. "Diane will testify that this level of digital manipulation requires specialized knowledge and skills that you simply don't possess." "But there's more," Foster continued, and something in her tone made David's stomach clench. "I also found evidence of financial transactions that appear to connect you to the fraud." She pulled up bank statements on the screen. David leaned forward, squinting at the numbers. "That's not my account," he said immediately. "Look at the account number." "That's not." "It's an account opened in your name," Foster interrupted. "At a bank in the Cayman Islands. Opened 3 years ago with your social security number and a copy of your driver's license." The room seemed to tilt. David gripped the arms of his chair, trying to process what he was hearing. "Someone stole my identity," he said. "Someone opened an account in my name." "Yes," Foster agreed. "And that account has received over $800,000 in deposits over the past 3 years. Small amounts, irregular intervals, designed to avoid triggering automatic fraud detection. The deposits correlate precisely with the dates of fraudulent certifications. $800,000. The number was staggering, incomprehensible. David thought of his modest salary, his careful budgeting, the home equity line of credit they'd needed for Emma's tuition. $800,000 would have changed everything. Would have eliminated their debt, secured Emma's future, let them retire comfortably. And someone had stolen his identity to make it look like he'd been receiving exactly that kind of money. "Who?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Who did this?" Chin and Foster exchanged a glance. "That's where things get complicated," Chin said. "Diane, show them the access logs." Foster brought up a new document, a spreadsheet filled with timestamps, user IDs, and system access records. She highlighted several entries. "These are the times when fraudulent certifications were created or when the hidden files were planted on your computer. In each case, the system logs show that your credentials were used to access the quality control database." "But I wasn't there," David said. "You just said." "You weren't there," Foster confirmed. "But someone was using your login credentials. And based on the patterns of access, the specific terminals used, and the timing of these activities, I was able to narrow down the possible suspects. She pulled up a new screen, this one showing a list of names with accompanying data. David leaned closer, his heart pounding. The first name on the list was Thomas Brennan, accounting manager, his best friend. The second name was Philip Hendricks, plant manager, David's boss. The third name was Marcus Webb, line supervisor, the man who always saved him a seat at the company picnic. David stared at the names, feeling like the floor was dropping out from beneath him. All of them? He asked. All three of them? Not necessarily, Foster said. But all three had the opportunity, the access, and the technical knowledge to do what was done. Brennan in particular had access to both financial systems and quality control systems due to his role in accounting. Hendricks had master-level administrative access to virtually everything. And Webb worked closely enough with you to have learned your routines, your passwords, your patterns. Tom Brennan is my friend, David said, but even as he spoke the words, he remembered what Sarah had told him. Tom had been telling people at the company that he always thought there was something off about you. Philip Hendricks hired me, David continued weakly. He's known me for 15 years. Why would he destroy me? Chin leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. That's what we need to find out. But David, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that someone you trusted, someone you considered a friend, has been systematically destroying your life for years. Sarah spoke for the first time since they'd sat down, her voice shaking. What about the money? The $800,000. Where is it now? Foster closed the laptop. That's the interesting part. The account was emptied 2 weeks ago. All of it transferred out to another offshore account that I haven't been able to trace yet. Whoever set this up was preparing for the investigation. They were covering their tracks. 2 weeks ago, David repeated. That's right before Carl Patterson's widow filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Brandt Manufacturing, Chin finished. Right before the federal investigation became public. Right before you were arrested. This was all timed very precisely. David stood abruptly, needing to move, to do something other than sit and absorb this nightmare. He walked to the window, looking down at the street below where normal people were going about their normal days, buying coffee, walking dogs, living lives that made sense. I want to confront them, he said, turning back to face the room. Tom, Phil, Marcus. I want to look them in the eye and ask them which one of them did this to me. Absolutely not, Chin said firmly. David, whoever did this has been planning it for years. They're smart, they're careful, and they're dangerous. If you confront them directly, you'll tip our hand and give them time to destroy more evidence or create more false trails. Then what do we do? David demanded, frustration and rage bubbling up inside him. Just sit here and wait while my life falls apart? While everyone in Millbrook thinks I'm a murderer? While my daughter reads articles online about her father being a fraud? We build a case, Chin said. Diane continues her digital forensics work. I file motions to compel Brandt Manufacturing to turn over additional records. We interview other employees, look for anyone who might have seen something suspicious, anyone who might have information about who had the means and opportunity to do this. And in the meantime? In the meantime, you stay quiet. You don't talk to anyone from Brandt. You don't discuss the case with anyone except Sarah, Diane, and me. You go about your life as normally as possible, and you let us do our jobs. David laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. Go about my life normally. I've been charged with manslaughter. I'm out on bail with my house as collateral. My neighbors won't look at me. My best friend is telling people I'm corrupt. My boss might be the one who framed me. How exactly am I supposed to act normally? Sarah stood and came to him, putting her hand on his arm. David, she said softly, please, listen to them. They're trying to help. He looked at his wife, saw the fear and exhaustion in her face, and felt his anger deflate. She was right. Chin and Foster were the only allies he had right now. Alienating them would be stupid. I'm sorry, he said, running his hands through his hair. This is all so much. I know, Chin said, his voice gentler now. And I'm sorry for what you're going through. But David, we have a real chance here. Diane's findings create reasonable doubt. More than that, they point toward a specific alternative explanation. If we can identify which of these three men was actually responsible, if we can prove they framed you, we can not only get the charges dismissed, we can get justice. Justice. The word that had defined David's entire worldview. The belief that truth mattered, that the system worked, that good people who did the right thing would be protected. But he'd learned over the past week that justice wasn't automatic. It wasn't a natural law that the universe followed. It was something you had to fight for, something you had to prove and defend, and sometimes something that slipped away despite your best efforts. There's one more thing, Foster said, opening her laptop again. Something I found that doesn't quite fit the pattern. She pulled up what looked like a personnel file. Marcus Webb, she said. I was doing background checks on all 3 suspects and I found something interesting. Webb has a brother, Anthony Webb, who did 3 years in federal prison for wire fraud. He was released 18 months ago. David's mind raced. You think Marcus's brother might be involved? I think it's a connection worth investigating, Foster said. Wire fraud requires exactly the kind of technical expertise we're seeing in this case. And if Marcus Webb was helping his brother execute a scheme, using you as the fall guy would serve 2 purposes. It would deflect suspicion from Marcus, and it would provide a convenient scapegoat if the scheme was ever discovered. But why me? David asked, the question that had been haunting him since this began. Why target me specifically? Foster shook her head. That I can't answer yet. But I will. I promise you, Mr. Mercer, I will find out who did this and why. Chin stood, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. David, Sarah, I know this is overwhelming. But we're making progress. Real progress. Go home, try to rest, and let us work. I'll be in touch as soon as we have more information. David and Sarah walked out of Chen's office in silence, down the stairs and out to their car in the parking lot. It wasn't until they were driving away, the Victorian house receding in the rearview mirror, that Sarah spoke. Do you believe them? She asked. That they can prove you didn't do this? David watched the streets of Harrisburg pass by the window, thought about the names on Foster's list, about the elaborate conspiracy that had been built around him like a cage. I believe they're trying, he said. I believe they found evidence that points away from me. But Sarah, even if we prove I didn't falsify those certifications, even if we identify who actually did it, people are going to remember me as the man who was arrested for killing Carl Patterson. That stain doesn't wash off. Not completely. So what do we do? David was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, we fight. We fight with everything we have, and we trust that the truth matters. Because if it doesn't, if we live in a world where an innocent man can be destroyed by lies and no one cares enough to dig for the truth, then what's the point of any of it? Sarah reached over and took his hand, squeezing tight. They drove home in silence, 2 people clinging to each other in the wreckage of the life they'd built, hoping that somewhere in the rubble they might find enough truth to rebuild. But as they pulled into their driveway, David saw something that made his blood run cold. Spray painted across their garage door in red letters 2 feet high were the words, "Murderer. Leave town." Sarah gasped, and David felt something inside him crack. Not break entirely, but crack. A fissure that went deep, threatening the foundation of who he was. Someone in Millbrook, his town, his community, a place where he'd lived for 30 years, hated him enough to vandalize his home, to threaten him, to judge him guilty without trial, without evidence, without even asking for his side of the story. He sat in the car, staring at those red letters, and felt the last of his faith in the fundamental goodness of the system begin to die. Call the police, Sarah whispered beside him. But David didn't move. Because what was the point? The police were part of the system. The system that had arrested him, charged him, paraded him in front of cameras as a criminal. The system he had trusted. The system that was destroying him. David, Sarah said more urgently, we need to call the police. Slowly, mechanically, David pulled out his phone and dialed 911. He reported the vandalism in a flat, emotionless voice. Gave his address. Confirmed he was the homeowner. Yes, he said when the dispatcher asked. Yes, he was the David Mercer. Yes, he understood why someone might be angry. No, he didn't know who did it. No, he didn't see anyone. No, he didn't feel unsafe. That last one was a lie. He felt profoundly unsafe. Not physically, he wasn't afraid of violence. But existentially unsafe, like the ground beneath his feet had turned to quicksand and he was slowly being pulled under while everyone he'd ever trusted stood on the shore and watched. 2 police officers arrived 20 minutes later. They took photos, wrote a report, asked perfunctory questions. One of them, a young officer David didn't recognize, looked at him with barely concealed contempt. The other, an older man named Patterson, and oh God, was he related to Carl? Was professionally neutral but distant. We'll file a report, Officer Patterson said. But Mr. Mercer, between you and me, you might want to consider what that paint is telling you. Millbrook is a small town. People here knew Carl. He was a good man. And they're angry. I didn't kill him, David said, the words automatic now ritual. Patterson's expression didn't change. That's for the courts to decide. In the meantime, I'd suggest you keep a low profile. for your own safety and your wife's." They left, and David stood in his driveway staring at the word murderer painted across his garage, understanding with terrible clarity that this was his life now. This was what he had become in the eyes of his community, regardless of truth, regardless of evidence, regardless of justice. He had trusted the system, and the system had destroyed him. Chapter 5: Ashes and Afterward. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in October, 5 months after David Mercer's arrest. The leaves outside the Millbrook County Courthouse were turning brilliant shades of orange and red, that annual transformation that had always filled David with a sense of renewal and possibility. Now those colors looked garish to him, almost mocking, as if nature itself was indifferent to human suffering. The prosecution's case was methodical and damning. For 3 weeks, they paraded witnesses and evidence before the jury. The forged certifications with David's signature, the testimony of federal investigators, the heartbreaking statements from Carl Patterson's widow and children. They brought in experts who explained how the faulty brake assembly had failed, how proper quality control would have caught the defect, how David Mercer's negligence, or worse, his deliberate fraud, had directly caused a man's death. Linda Patterson took the stand on the 8th day of trial. She was a slight woman in her early 50s, her hair prematurely gray, her face carved with grief. She spoke in a quiet voice about her husband, about the morning he'd left for work and never came home, about identifying his body at the morgue, about explaining to their 12-year-old daughter that Daddy wasn't coming back. "We trusted that the equipment was safe," she said, her eyes finding David across the courtroom. "We never thought that someone would cut corners, would put profits over lives." Carl trusted his machinery, and that trust killed him. David wanted to stand up, to scream that he hadn't done it, that he would never have certified faulty parts, that someone had framed him. But Robert Chen's hand on his arm kept him seated, kept him silent, and he could only watch as the widow's testimony carved another piece out of his soul. The prosecution rested after 3 weeks, having built what seemed like an insurmountable case. The jury looked at David with expressions ranging from disgust to pity, and he understood that in their minds he was already guilty. The trial was just a formality. Then it was the defense's turn. Robert Chen stood and called Diane Foster to the stand. For 2 days, Foster methodically dismantled the prosecution's narrative. She explained the digital forensics, the planted files, the manipulated metadata. She showed how certifications bearing David's signature had been created while he was provably elsewhere. She walked the jury through the sophisticated technical knowledge required to execute such a frame job. "This wasn't opportunistic fraud," Foster testified. "This was a carefully planned, years-long conspiracy to make David Mercer appear guilty of crimes he didn't commit." The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Elizabeth Moreno, was relentless in cross-examination. "But Miss Foster, isn't it true that Mr. Mercer had the technical access to create these hidden files himself?" "Technically yes, but..." "And isn't it true that your analysis can't definitively prove that someone else created these files, only that they exist in a suspicious location?" "The totality of the evidence suggests." "Please answer the question, Miss Foster. Can you prove with absolute certainty that David Mercer didn't create these files himself?" Pause. A terrible, damning pause. "Not with absolute certainty, no." Moreno smiled thinly. "No further questions." Chin called other witnesses. Co-workers who testified to David's character, his reputation for integrity, his meticulous attention to detail. Sarah took the stand and spoke about their marriage, their financial situation, her absolute belief in her husband's innocence. Emma came home from Penn State and testified through tears about her father, about the man who had built her a swing set and coached her softball team and never, ever cut corners. But character testimony couldn't overcome the physical evidence. The signatures, the emails, the offshore account opened in David's name. On the 4th week of trial, Chin played his final card. He called Marcus Webb to the stand. Webb looked different than David remembered. Thinner, more nervous. His easy smile was gone, replaced by a tense wariness. He took the oath and sat down, his eyes darting around the courtroom. Chin approached slowly, like a hunter approaching skittish prey. "Mr. Webb, you worked closely with David Mercer at Brandt Manufacturing, is that correct?" "Yes." "And you had access to the quality control systems?" "Some access, yes. For coordination purposes." "Did you ever use Mr. Mercer's login credentials?" Webb's jaw tightened. "No." "Are you aware that your brother, Anthony Webb, was convicted of wire fraud and served 3 years in federal prison?" Objection. Moreno was on her feet. "Relevance." "Your Honor, The defense will show that this is directly relevant to the question of who had the means and motive to frame Mr. Mercer. Judge Harrison, a stern woman in her 60s, considered. I'll allow it. But get to the point, Mr. Chin. Chin turned back to Webb. Did your brother help you access David Mercer's computer systems? No. I didn't do anything wrong. Then why did you meet with your brother 17 times over the past 3 years, according to visitor logs from his parole officer? What were you discussing? Webb's face had gone pale. Family matters. He's my brother. I was helping him reintegrate. Chin pulled out a document. This is a record of a cryptocurrency transaction from an account linked to your brother to an account in your name. The transaction occurred 3 weeks ago, just days after the investigation into Brandt Manufacturing became public. The amount was $743,000. Where did that money come from, Mr. Webb? The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison banged her gavel, calling for order. Marcus Webb sat frozen in the witness chair, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. I want a lawyer. Mr. Webb, Chin pressed, did you and your brother use David Mercer's credentials to falsify quality control certifications? Did you open an offshore account in his name? Did you frame an innocent man? Your Honor. Moreno was shouting now. This is harassment of the witness. But Webb was breaking. David could see the careful facade crumbling. I didn't mean for anyone to die, Webb said suddenly, the words tumbling out. It was just supposed to be, we were just trying to make some money. Carl Patterson wasn't supposed to. Mr. Webb, stop talking. Moreno commanded. But Marcus Webb had started and he couldn't seem to stop. Anthony knew how to do it, how to make it look like David. And David was so perfect, so self-righteous, always following the rules, always doing everything right. He made the rest of us look bad. Anthony thought, if we set it up right, if we were careful, no one would ever know. The parts weren't that bad. They were just slightly off-spec. We didn't think. He broke down then, sobbing, and Judge Harrison called for a recess. The courtroom dissolved into chaos, reporters rushing for the doors, Linda Patterson crying in the front row, Sarah gripping David's hand so hard it hurt. David sat very still, watching Marcus Webb being led away by bailiffs, and felt nothing. Not vindication. Not relief. Not even anger. Just a vast, echoing emptiness where his faith in humanity used to reside. The charges against David Mercer were dismissed 3 days later. Marcus Webb, faced with overwhelming evidence of his guilt, accepted a plea deal. He testified that he and his brother had conceived the scheme together, that they had used David as the scapegoat because his reputation for perfectionism would make the eventual discovery of fraud seem like a spectacular fall from grace. Anthony Webb was arrested. Phil Hendricks, the plant manager, was also implicated. He had known about the fraud and had accepted payments to look the way. Tom Brennan, it turned out, had simply been a coward. He'd suspected something was wrong but had convinced himself it wasn't his problem. When David was arrested, Tom had protected himself by distancing himself from his former friend, by suggesting to anyone who would listen that David had always seemed slightly off. It should have been a happy ending. Justice, finally, after months of nightmare. David's name cleared. The real criminals identified and punished. But David Mercer stood in the courthouse hallway after the dismissal, surrounded by reporters shouting questions, and understood that there were some things that couldn't be undone. The prosecution held a press conference. Elizabeth Moreno stood at a podium and said all the right things. We are grateful that the truth has come to light. We apologize to Mr. Mercer for the ordeal he has endured. The system, while imperfect, has ultimately served justice. David watched it on the news that evening, sitting in his living room with Sarah, and laughed. A harsh, bitter sound that made Sarah flinch. The system served justice, he repeated. The system destroyed me. The system arrested me, paraded me in front of cameras, let my neighbors spray paint murderer on my garage. The system put us through hell for 5 months, and now they want credit for fixing their own mistake. Sarah was quiet. They'd barely spoken over the past few days, both of them processing the whiplash of vindication after so long believing David might actually go to prison. We can rebuild, she said finally. David, we can put this behind us and rebuild. But David shook his head. Can we? Mrs. Patterson still thinks I'm responsible for her husband's death. Half of Millbrook still believes I'm guilty, that I just got off on a technicality. I see the way people look at me in the grocery store. I see them cross the street to avoid talking to me. That will fade. Once people understand what really happened. They don't want to understand, David interrupted. They've already decided who I am. The truth is too complicated, too unsatisfying. It's easier to believe I'm guilty than to accept that the system failed, that an innocent man was almost destroyed while the real criminals hid in plain sight. Emma came downstairs, her footsteps soft on the stairs. She dropped out of Penn State for the semester to be home during the trial. Now she stood in the doorway, looking at her parents with eyes that had aged years in just a few months. "I'm going back to school," she said quietly. "I can't. I need to get away from here." David understood. Millbrook had become toxic for all of them. The whispers, the stares, the persistent cloud of suspicion that followed them everywhere despite the dismissal of charges. "That's good, sweetheart," he said. "You should go. Live your life." "What about you?" Emma asked. "What are you going to do?" David didn't have an answer. Brandt Manufacturing offered him his job back 3 weeks later. A formal letter from the new plant manager, Phil Hendricks, had been fired, expressing regret for what had happened and extending an invitation to return to his position with full back pay. David burned the letter in the fireplace. He couldn't go back there. Couldn't walk those floors where Marcus Webb had worked beside him for years, planning his destruction. Couldn't sit in that office where he'd been called in that terrible Tuesday morning. Couldn't smile and make small talk with co-workers who had been so quick to believe the worst of him. Linda Patterson filed a civil lawsuit against Brandt Manufacturing, Marcus Webb, Anthony Webb, and the estate of Carl Patterson. She specifically requested that David not be included as a defendant, and her lawyer issued a public statement acknowledging David's innocence. It was something. A small gesture of recognition. But it didn't bring Carl Patterson back. Didn't erase the months David had spent as a murder suspect in the eyes of Patterson's widow and children. David attended one of the preliminary hearings. He sat in the back of the courtroom and watched Linda Patterson testify about her husband, about their life together, about the future that had been stolen from them. When the hearing ended and people filed out, David found himself face to face with her in the hallway. They stood there for a long moment, two people connected by tragedy and injustice, both victims of Marcus Webb's greed. "I'm sorry," David said quietly. "I'm so sorry for what happened to your husband. I know my words don't change anything, but I need you to know, I would never have certified those parts if I'd known. I would never have let them ship. I took my job seriously because I understood that lives depended on it." Linda Patterson looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I know," she said. "My lawyer explained everything. I know you didn't do it. But Mr. Mercer, knowing that doesn't make it hurt less. My husband is still gone. My children still have to grow up without a father. And every time I see your face, I'm reminded of it all." "I understand," David said, and he did. He understood that they were both casualties of the same crime, both suffering in different ways for sins they didn't commit. "I hope you can find peace," Linda said. "I mean that sincerely. You deserve it." She walked away, and David stood in the courthouse hallway wondering if peace was something he would ever find again. 6 months after the charges were dismissed, David and Sarah sold their house in Millbrook. They took a loss on it. The notoriety of the case had made it difficult to sell, and they'd finally accepted an offer well below market value just to be done with it. They moved to a small town in Vermont, a place where no one knew their names or their story. David took a job teaching at a community college, quality control and manufacturing processes, ironically enough. Sarah found work at a local elementary school. They rented a modest apartment and began the slow, painful process of building a new life. Emma finished her degree at Penn State and immediately moved to Seattle, as far from Pennsylvania as she could reasonably get. She called every Sunday, but the conversations were stilted, careful. The trial had changed her, had shown her that the world wasn't as fair or as safe as she'd believed. David could hear it in her voice, could hear the loss of innocence, and it broke his heart. On a Tuesday morning in March, almost exactly a year after his arrest, David stood at the window of their Vermont apartment and watched snow fall over the unfamiliar landscape. He was 54 years old. He had lost his career, his home, his community, his faith in the fundamental fairness of the system he trusted all his life. But he was alive. He was free. And slowly, incrementally, he was learning to live with what had happened. Sarah came up behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist, rested her head against his back. They stood like that for a long time, two people who had survived something that should have destroyed them, holding on to each other because it was all they had left. "Do you ever wish we could go back?" Sarah asked quietly. "To before? When everything made sense." David thought about it. About the man he'd been a year ago, driving his silver Honda Accord down familiar streets, believing that honesty and hard work mattered, that the system protected the innocent, that justice was something more than a concept that looked good on paper. "No," he said finally. "That man was naive. He believed in things that weren't true. I'd rather live with the truth even if it's ugly than go back to comfortable lies." "What is the truth?" Sarah asked. David was quiet for a long moment, watching the snow fall, thinking about Marcus Webb and Phil Hendricks, about Elizabeth Moreno apologizing for the system's imperfection, about the word murderer spray painted on his garage, about Linda Patterson's face when she said knowing he was innocent didn't make it hurt less. "The truth," he said slowly, "is that the system doesn't care about individuals. It's a machine, and machines don't have compassion or mercy or even the capacity to recognize their own failures. The truth is that trusting the system is a luxury only the lucky can afford. The rest of us just have to survive it as best we can." "That's bleak," Sarah said. "Yes," David agreed. "It is." But he didn't let go of her, and she didn't let go of him, and together they stood at the window watching the snow cover everything in white, making the world look clean and new even though they both knew it was neither of those things. In Millbrook, Pennsylvania, the story of David Mercer faded into local legend. Some people remembered it as a cautionary tale about corruption. Others remembered it as proof that the system worked, that justice eventually prevailed. A few people, not many, remembered it as what it actually was. A demonstration of how easily an ordinary person could be destroyed by forces beyond their control. Marcus Webb was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Anthony Webb got 20. Phil Hendricks got 8 years and a permanent ban from ever working in manufacturing again. Brandt Manufacturing paid a multi-million-dollar settlement to Linda Patterson and implemented new quality control procedures. The system declared itself satisfied. Justice had been served. But in a small apartment in Vermont, David Mercer woke up some mornings and reached for his phone to check his work email before remembering that he didn't work at Brandt anymore, that his old life was gone, that nothing would ever be the same. He had trusted the system. The system had destroyed him. And the fact that he'd eventually been vindicated didn't change the fundamental truth that the system had failed him first, had presumed him guilty, had stolen months of his life and branded him with a scarlet letter that would never completely fade. On good days, David told himself that he'd survived, that he'd found a kind of peace in his new life, that what hadn't killed him had made him wiser if not stronger. On bad days, he knew the truth, that there were some damages that couldn't be repaired, some betrayals that couldn't be forgiven, some losses that would echo through the rest of his life. He had learned what the system really was. Not a guardian of justice. Not a protector of the innocent. Just a machine that ground forward with mechanical indifference, crushing some people while protecting others and calling the result justice. And once you learned that lesson, once you really understood it in your bones, you could never unlearn it. David Mercer lived with that knowledge for the rest of his days. Some mornings it sat light on his shoulders, barely noticeable. Other mornings it pressed down like a boulder, making it hard to breathe, hard to remember why getting out of bed mattered. But he got up anyway. He taught his classes. He came home to Sarah. He called Emma on Sundays. He lived his life, such as it was, in the shadow of what had been done to him. And sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, he thought about all the other David Mercers out there. The ordinary people who trusted the system, who believed in fairness and justice and the fundamental decency of the institutions that governed their lives. He wondered how many of them would learn, as he had learned, that trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. He wondered how many would survive the lesson. He wondered if any of them would ever truly recover. The snow kept falling outside his window, covering the world in white, making everything look pure and clean and new. But David Mercer knew better now. He knew that underneath the pristine surface, the world was exactly what it had always been. Indifferent, unjust, and dangerous to anyone naive enough to believe otherwise. He had trusted the system. The system had destroyed him. And that truth, more than any vindication, more than any apology, more than any attempt at justice after the fact, was the only thing he knew with absolute certainty. It was the only thing he would ever know for sure again.